Lenora Whitcomb stood at the edge of the spring behind my house and pointed at the clear water like she was pointing at something she already owned. She called me a backwoods handyman in front of two of her board members, ordered the valve locked, and mailed me a fine big enough to threaten the roof over my head. She had no idea my grandfather had hidden a copper map tube under the floor of the old mill shed. Inside it was a covenant dated 1894, stamped with the county seal, carrying a clause that had never once been revoked. When the judge finally read it out loud in open court, the smile on her face disappeared for good, and so did everything she thought she controlled. If you like watching someone who abuses power get silenced by their own paperwork, stay with me, because this one earns every second of the wait. I came back to Cedar Hollow the spring after my grandfather, Walter Rourke, passed away, and the stone house he left me sat just outside the manicured core of the development, close enough for the homeowners association to claim jurisdiction, and far enough that nobody ever bothered to explain how. Behind the house ran a spring we had always called Alder Spring, a narrow vein of water that came down through an old stone trough before spilling into the community's ornamental pond half a mile downhill. My grandfather used to stand at that trough with his sleeves rolled up and tell me, "Share the water when folks need it, but never let anyone tell you it stopped being yours." I never thought of that sentence as a legal warning. I thought it was the kind of thing an old man says about a creek he loved, not something I would ever need in a courtroom. For years, our family had drawn only a small branch of that spring for the garden, the greenhouse, and a backup line into the house, while the association used the overflow to water its landscaping and top off the community pond, all of it running on a handshake agreement between my grandfather and the board that came before Lenora. Nobody wrote anything down because nobody needed to. Then, not long after I moved back in, Lenora Whitcomb walked onto my property without calling first, examined the old piping like an appraiser cataloging a foreclosure, photographed the valve, and asked whether I had a permit to use the spring at all. I assumed she was doing routine due diligence, the kind of thing a new HOA president does when she wants to look thorough. Before she left, she looked at the water and told me I should get used to the idea that this was not my grandfather's farm anymore. And I remember thinking the comment was strange, though I still had no idea how strange it would turn out to be. The house itself had been standing since long before Cedar Hollow existed as anything more than open pasture and a scatter of grazing cattle, its stone walls laid by hands that understood how to build something meant to outlast them. I spent my days restoring timber frames and hand-cut joinery for clients scattered across the county, work that demanded patience and an eye trained to notice what a careless glance would miss. And I brought that same attention home with me every evening when I walked the property my grandfather had left behind. The sound of the spring was the first thing I remembered from childhood summers, water moving over stone in a steady rhythm that never once changed no matter how the seasons turned around it. I had assumed that permanence was simply a fact of the land, the way a mountain feels permanent to anyone standing at its base, never imagining it could become a battlefield. The next morning I found a new metal sign staked into the bank of the spring, freshly bolted and gleaming in the early light, reading property of the Homeowners Association, unauthorized water extraction prohibited, and I stood there in my work boots holding my coffee, staring at a sign someone had planted on land my family had held since before the county even paved the road in front of it. I carried that sign into the HOA office myself and asked Lenora to explain it, and she agreed to see me, though she made a point of leaving the conference room door open so the staff and a couple of board members lingering in the hallway could hear every word. She told me Alder Spring sat inside what she called the shared watershed, which she said placed it under association authority regardless of parcel lines. I told her the mouth of the spring sat entirely inside my family's boundary, and she smiled the way people smile when they think they are educating someone slower than themselves, telling me modern plat maps only reflect surface acreage and prove nothing about water rights. She kept calling me the carpenter, even after I explained that I restore historic timber framing for a living, work that requires more precision than she seemed willing to credit me with. Men like you, she said, see a fence line and a stream and start imagining you're building a kingdom. When I asked her to produce anything proving the association actually owned the spring, she slid across a 1998 subdivision map with a blue line running from my property down to the community pond, labeled Shared Water System in tidy printed letters. I noticed that the blue line had been drawn directly over older survey marks, faint pencil ghosts beneath the fresh ink, but I did not yet have the knowledge to challenge what I was looking at. She informed me I had 48 hours to disconnect the line feeding my greenhouse or face a penalty of $500 a day, and when I refused to sign the violation notice, she said men like me usually only understand a problem once they see it on an invoice. She suggested, almost gently, that I consider selling before my pride bankrupted me, and I walked out of that office into a hallway full of board members who suddenly found their shoes very interesting. Only Tessa Boone, the treasurer, glanced up as I passed, her eyes following me, with something that looked less like judgment and more like worry. That afternoon, without warning, the water stopped running into my greenhouse even though the spring itself was still flowing strong just a few yards away, and I found the main valve on my own land locked with a padlock stamped with the association's crest, a laminated warning zip-tied to the handle telling me not to tamper with it. Within a day, the seedlings in the greenhouse had begun to wilt, and the cooling line for my restoration workshop went dry, and when I called the HOA office, Lenora would not come to the phone. Her email that evening informed me the association had, in her words, protected shared community assets from unauthorized exploitation, language that felt lifted straight from a press release rather than a neighbor talking to a neighbor. I called the county sheriff's office, and the deputy who came out told me this looked like a civil property dispute since both sides were waiving paperwork, which was technically true and completely useless to a man watching his plants die of thirst. Within days, Lenora had sent a notice to the entire development describing me as a resident hoarding water during a drought emergency, and I began to notice a shift in the way my neighbors looked at me at the mailboxes, as if my name had become shorthand for the reason their dues kept climbing. At the next community meeting, she projected a photograph of my greenhouse piping onto the screen and called it an industrial pumping operation, when in truth it was a modest line that had been running quietly for decades before she ever set foot in Cedar Hollow. When I stood to correct her, she talked over me twice, told the room I lacked the standing to understand community governance, and suggested people with real expertise should be the ones handling it. Muscle, she said, looking straight at me, does not make an argument legal. I had never raised my voice, never threatened a soul, yet she kept painting me as some hot-tempered laborer who needed to be managed, and I made myself stay calm because I understood, even then, that losing my composure was exactly what she wanted from me. Lenora had built her career selling luxury properties before she ever ran for the board, and it showed in the way she carried herself through that meeting, every gesture calculated to project authority rather than persuasion, every pause timed for effect rather than thought. She never raised her voice the way I might have expected from someone cornered, choosing instead a flat, patient tone that made her insults land harder, precisely because they sounded so reasonable coming out of her mouth. I noticed she never once looked directly at the blue line on her own map while she spoke about it, as though some part of her already understood how thin that ink actually was. Still, she held the room the way a skilled auctioneer holds a crowd, and by the time she finished speaking, Half the board seemed to have forgotten I had walked in with a legitimate grievance rather than a complaint to be managed. I asked the board to produce a bill of sale for the spring itself, and nobody in that room could find one, which did not stop Lenora from closing the meeting by levying a penalty of $12,500 against me, a mix of retroactive fines and what she called water protection costs, with a warning that failure to pay within 10 days would result in a lien against my house. I drove home past the pond the association had been so eager to protect and looked at the spring running past my own kitchen window. Water I was no longer permitted to touch, and I thought again of my grandfather's warning, wondering for the first time whether he had known this day was coming long before I ever did. When I sat down at his old writing desk that night, searching for anything that might help, I found a slip of paper tucked beneath the blotter with 6 words written in his careful hand. Under the mill, follow the copper pipe. And I understood that whatever he had hidden it on purpose. I stood in the doorway of that shed for a long moment before I touched anything. The smell of old stone and damp timber thick in the air, sunlight cutting through gaps in the roof in narrow gold bands that landed across the floorboards like markers pointing the way forward. The mill was what my grandfather had always called that old stone shed by the spring. A squat building that once housed a water wheel back when Cedar Hollow was nothing but pasture and timber at the close of the 19th century. I pried up the rotted floorboards inside and found a length of copper pipe running toward the north wall, a pipe that no longer carried water and instead terminated in a hollow behind the stone that someone had plastered over long ago. Inside that hollow sat a small metal box holding a brass key, a photograph of my grandfather standing beside a survey marker, and a water-stained copy of a 1987 usage permit. That permit allowed the Cedar Hollow development to draw the surplus flow from Alder Spring, and more importantly, it identified my grandfather by name as the holder of the water rights to the spring itself. The final page, however, had suffered enough water damage that the termination clauses were nearly impossible to read, faded ink bleeding into ruined paper. I drove the document to the county records office and found Maren Pike behind the counter, a quiet, meticulous woman who had spent decades cataloging land parcels most people never bothered to think about. She checked the modern title index and found no trace of any water right attached to my deed, and she explained that older water rights were sometimes recorded separately from surface ownership, filed in books dedicated to springs, mines, and water conveyances rather than land itself. Records before 1900, she told me, had never been fully digitized, and together we finally found a single reference line buried in an index card, Alder Grant, Book W-3, Entry 17, 1894. According to the borrowing log, that particular volume had been checked out to the planning department in 1998, the exact year Cedar Hollow was developed, and the record showed no indication it had ever been returned. Maren pulled out a magnifying glass and studied the index card a second time, tracing the faded entry with one careful finger, and told me she had seen missing volumes before, usually when a developer wanted a particular history to disappear quietly rather than dispute it openly. I began to wonder whether the developer and the association had known about this water right from the very beginning and had simply buried it. Maren warned me that a damaged photocopy would never be enough to win anything in court, that I needed either the original, a certified copy, or a modern acknowledgement of the old grant, and I left the records office understanding I had a thread but not yet a rope. Back home, I tried the brass key against every lock my grandfather had ever owned, drawers and cabinets and toolboxes, until I finally noticed its shape matched the padlock visible in the photograph of the survey marker, and the next morning I hiked to the marker's location expecting to find it exactly where the photo showed it. Instead, I found the ground torn open, the marker itself gone, Wide tire tracks pressed into the mud, leading directly back toward the maintenance road. Tracks I recognized because I had watched the same vehicle roll past my window a dozen times that month. I photographed the tracks and reported the missing marker, and Lenora denied any association involvement, insisting her maintenance crew had only cleared what she described as hazardous scrap metal from the property line. When I asked to see the marker itself, she told me it had already been hauled off for disposal, an answer that closed the door before I could push through it. The HOA scheduled a special hearing to address my accumulating fines, and I walked in carrying the 1987 permit, believing it would finally force her to back down. In front of the entire board, I read aloud the line naming my grandfather as the water rights holder, and I watched the room stir with genuine surprise, murmurs passing from chair to chair. Lenora did not look surprised at all. She produced her own copy of the same document, and in her version an added paragraph claimed the rights to Alder Spring had been permanently transferred to the developer once construction of the neighborhood was complete. I noticed immediately that the added paragraph used a different typeface than the rest of the page, a detail so obvious it seemed almost careless, yet she pressed forward without hesitation. She mocked my copy as nothing more than a damp scrap pulled from beneath a floorboard, and she implied, in front of everyone, that I might have altered it myself to protect my property. This, she told the board, turning to address them directly rather than me, is exactly what happens when a man refuses to accept that his family's era has ended. Tessa Boone studied Lenora's copy closely and asked where the original document was being kept, and Lenora refused to answer, calling it confidential association business not open to discussion. The board voted to uphold every fine against me, with Tessa the lone dissenting voice, and Lenora was granted permission to fence off the spring entirely, citing the need to prevent vandalism. As the meeting broke up, Tessa slipped a folded note into my hand on her way out the door, a slip of paper bearing the invoice number of a commercial water supply company. She whispered that the association had been quietly selling surplus water to a landscaping contractor for 3 straight years, a fact that sat in direct contradiction to every word Lenora had spoken about protecting the community during a drought. I understood then that this had never really been about controlling a spring. Alder Spring was hiding money, and Lenora had built an entire narrative to keep anyone from noticing. That night, my security camera caught something I had not expected. The maintenance crew moving toward the stone mill carrying a demolition order Lenora had already signed, arriving before dawn as if speed alone might settle the matter before I could stop them. I reached the mill before the excavator started and told the crew supervisor to hold off, and he showed me an emergency order claiming the structure posed a collapse risk that threatened the shared water system, language that sounded rehearsed the moment he read it aloud. I recorded the entire exchange on my phone and pointed out that the mill stood entirely on my land and had never been inspected by anyone qualified to declare it dangerous. The crew reluctantly paused while I called the county building office, and an inspector named Wade Carver arrived within the hour to confirm that the association had no authority to demolish anything on private property without due process. Carver also noticed the carved survey symbols cut into the foundation stones, marks that clearly predated the neighborhood by a century, and he made a note of it before he left. Once everyone had gone, I searched the wall where the metal box had been hidden and found a single stone bearing a symbol that matched the one etched into my brass key. Behind that stone was a small lock, and the key finally turned something, opening a narrow cavity that held a bronze map tube, the very object my grandfather had apparently prepared for someone to find. My hands were shaking when I opened it, certain I had finally reached the end of the search, but the tube was empty. I thought, for one sick moment, that I had arrived too late, that Lenora or her father before her had already found and destroyed whatever it once contained. Etched faintly into the base of the tube were the words, "Do not keep the deed beside the water. Look where the flow begins." I followed the spring upstream past the property line until I found a collapsed pump house buried under decades of ivy, and inside its rotted floor I found a canvas survey map folded so many times it nearly crumbled in my hands. The map showed the spring's true source running more than 40 feet deeper into my family's land than anyone had ever accounted for, with a conveyance line labeled Rourke Spring Easement, 1894, cutting through what later became the heart of Cedar Hollow. I brought it straight to Maren, who examined the ink, the symbols, and the seal, and confirmed everything was consistent with authentic surveying work from the close of the 19th century. Still, she reminded me that a map alone was only supporting evidence, that the original covenant itself was the only document that could settle ownership in a courtroom. She called the old planning archive and reached a retired clerk who remembered that Book W-3 had eventually been moved to a basement storage room in the county's old administrative building, a building scheduled for full cleanout by the end of the week. Before we could get there, my attorney, Drew Halstead, called with news that stopped me cold. The association had filed for an emergency injunction demanding I be barred from the spring entirely. The hearing was set for 3 days later, and if I lost, I could be legally forbidden from stepping onto a portion of my own land. Drew reviewed every scrap I had and warned me the court would favor certified documents over anything fragile or unverified, and that a stained permit and a canvas map, however genuine they looked to us, might not be enough to overturn a filed 1998 record. He examined my house deed and pointed to a vague clause stating the property was subject to any water conveyances existing prior to the date of transfer, language Lenora would surely read as proof my land was obligated to serve the shared system. Drew argued the opposite reading was just as valid, that Cedar Hollow itself might be the party bound to respect a conveyance that predated its own creation, but without the original 1894 covenant, the argument remained theoretical. Maren and I made it to the basement archive the next morning and dug through boxes ruined by decades of moisture and mildew, and while we recovered Book W-2 and Book W-4, the volume we needed had simply vanished. A transfer log showed the missing volume had been checked out and signed for by an attorney representing the Cedar Hollow developer back in 1998. And the signature belonged to a man named Preston Whitcomb, Lenora's own father. That single name rearranged everything I thought I understood, suggesting Lenora might have known about the water rights since the very founding of the neighborhood rather than discovering them alongside me. Maren located a badly degraded roll of microfilm from that era, but the reader in the archive was broken. So we carried it to the County Historical Library instead, where the first frames came through faint and grainy. The index-confirmed entry 17 ran 4 pages long, and the first page named my ancestor, Samuel Rourke, as the purchaser of the water right, with the second page describing the boundaries in careful surveyor's language. The third page had been scorched at some point in its history and was almost entirely unreadable, while the fourth held only a fragment of a signature and the edge of an old wax seal. Drew explained that the missing third page likely held the most important language of all: priority rights, transferability, and any conditions under which the grant could ever be terminated, and without it Lenora could still argue in court that the right had long since expired. When I got home that evening, an envelope from the association was waiting on my porch, and inside it was an offer to purchase my house for far less than it was worth, promising every fine would vanish the moment I signed. The deadline for a response fell on the very same day as the injunction hearing, which told me everything about how deliberate the timing had been. Tucked behind the offer letter was a rendering of a private spa development, and Lenora had circled the spring itself as its future centerpiece. a detail she had clearly never intended for me to see. That spa rendering told me exactly why Lenora wanted the spring so badly, proving a financial motive far beyond any talk of community stewardship, and Drew advised me to keep the discovery quiet rather than tip our hand before the hearing. I went back to my grandfather's house, searching for any clue to the missing third page, and I remembered how he used to press important papers flat inside the family Bible that still sat on his nightstand. Inside the back cover, I found a handwritten list of dates, and the year 1894 had been circled twice in pencil, with a line beneath it reading, "Certified copy at the old bank, Box 117. The old bank had closed its doors years earlier, but its safe deposit contents had been transferred to a trust company in the county seat, and the same brass key from the metal box carried the faint number 117 scratched into its shaft. After I proved my inheritance to the trust company, they allowed me to open the box myself, and what I found inside changed the entire shape of the fight ahead. Inside sat the fully certified copy of the 1894 covenant, complete with the county's raised seal, the intact third page, and a letter my grandfather had written but apparently never sent. The decisive clause granted the Rourke family permanent ownership of Alder Spring, priority use of its entire flow, and full authority to permit or terminate any conveyance crossing neighboring parcels. Most importantly, the right was tied to the land itself rather than to any single owner's name, which meant no association or developer could ever legally strip it away regardless of how many decades passed. The covenant further stated that any commercial use of the water without the landowner's consent required full restitution of whatever profit had been earned from it. My grandfather's letter explained that he had allowed Cedar Hollow to draw the surplus flow purely out of kindness toward his new neighbors, never intending it as anything more than a revocable courtesy rather than a transfer of ownership. He wrote that he had suspected Preston Whitcomb of tampering with the 1998 paperwork, which was exactly why he had moved the certified original into the bank's keeping rather than leaving it anywhere near the property. Anger settled into me differently than I expected, quiet and heavy, at the thought that Lenora had twisted my grandfather's generosity into a weapon against his own family. Drew arranged for the trust company to certify the chain of custody, and Marin cross-checked the seal against the county's historical registry, confirming everything was authentic beyond any reasonable doubt. We decided not to share any of it with the association before the hearing, since the emergency injunction allowed new evidence to be introduced directly in court. That night, Tessa called to warn me that Lenora was pressuring the board to approve the spa contract before the judge could even rule, desperate to lock in her plans while she still believed she held the upper hand, and she added one more detail that made my stomach turn. Lenora had ordered every water sale invoice destroyed by the following morning, hoping to erase 3 years of evidence before anyone thought to look for it. Tessa quietly copied every invoice before they could be shredded, and the paper trail showed the association had collected several $100,000 from selling surplus water over 3 years, while simultaneously charging residents a so-called drought surcharge. As if the community were desperately short of water, it had actually been selling the whole time. Drew said the discovery would likely trigger a separate financial audit down the line, but our first priority remained protecting my ownership of the spring itself. On the morning of the hearing, Lenora arrived with 3 attorneys and a cluster of board members trailing behind her, radiating the same confidence she always carried, and she found a moment in the hallway to lean close and tell me quietly that history did not belong to whoever kept old belongings. It belonged to whoever controlled the paperwork. She added, almost as an afterthought, that my search through old records looked like a grown man playing at treasure hunting, and I let the words pass without giving her the satisfaction of a reaction. Inside the courtroom, her attorney produced a supposed transfer of water rights dated 1998, bearing a signature meant to resemble my grandfather's. According to that document, Walter Rourke had transferred every right to Alder Spring to the association for the sum of $1, a document I had never once seen or heard mentioned in all my years visiting him. Drew discovered the notarization date fell during a period when my grandfather had actually been hospitalized in another state entirely, a detail that undercut the document before anyone even examined the handwriting. The signature itself lacked the distinctive upward hook he always used, a habit visible on every bank form and legal paper he had ever signed in his lifetime. Lenora suggested, with a small dismissive laugh, that a man who worked with his hands had no business questioning a notarized legal document. Judge Everett Sloan, presiding with the same flat patience he was known for throughout the county, asked to see the original rather than the photocopy in front of him. The association's attorney admitted the original had apparently been lost sometime during an office relocation, an excuse the judge received with visible skepticism. Drew presented proof of exactly where my grandfather had been hospitalized on the supposed date of signing, and then Tessa Boone rose from the gallery, asking the court's permission to submit an email she had saved before it could be deleted. That email showed Lenora directing the board to rely on what she called the transfer document from my father's files, language that made clear this was Preston Whitcomb's paperwork being reused, not some newly discovered record. For the first time since I had known her, Lenora's composure cracked, and she accused Tessa openly of betraying the association in front of the entire courtroom. The judge reminded her sharply that a courtroom was not a board meeting and instructed her to remain silent while proceedings continued. Drew then introduced the certified 1894 covenant, and Lenora laughed again, insisting that no century-old scrap of paper could ever override a modern association's authority. Judge Sloan lifted his glasses, turned to the seventh clause, and told her plainly that she should hear what it said before dismissing it. I felt my own pulse in my ears as the judge turned that brittle page, aware that everything my grandfather had hidden, everything Marin had helped me trace through faded index cards and ruined microfilm, now rested on the patience of one man reading slowly in a quiet room. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read the seventh clause aloud in full, confirming that Alder Spring belonged permanently to the parcel held by the Rourke family, a right that could never be seized by any homeowners association, formed decades after the grant was written. He continued into the section governing conveyance, explaining that Cedar Hollow was only ever entitled to receive surplus flow when the landowner chose to permit it. Locking the valve on my own property, he said, constituted trespass and unlawful interference with a legally protected water right, not the reasonable enforcement Lenora had described. Selling that water for commercial gain, he added, fell entirely outside the scope of the 1987 permit that had governed the arrangement for decades. Drew then produced the original 1998 subdivision map, and a small margin note, nearly invisible at the edge, stated that the community system depended on a private Alder Spring license, a detail Lenora's earlier presentation had conveniently cropped away. The judge observed that a modern deed does not erase an older grant, but instead must be read alongside it, and Lenora's entire argument collapsed under the weight of that single principle. Her attorney tried one last angle, suggesting decades of continuous use had earned the association some form of implied right regardless of the paperwork. Drew answered that use under a revocable permit could never ripen into ownership, that a landowner's generosity could not later be twisted into hostile possession against him. Judge Sloan agreed without hesitation, denied any request to bar me from the spring, and instead issued an order compelling the association to remove the lock from the valve, take down the fence on my property, halt every commercial water sale, cancel the fines levied against me in full, and preserve every financial and 1998 record for further review. On the matter of the forged signature, he stopped short of a criminal finding on the spot, but referred the document to the appropriate authorities for investigation. Lenora insisted she had only ever been protecting the community, and the judge told her flatly that protecting a community never required concealing one resident's legal property rights. Then he read the covenant's closing line aloud, stating plainly that no successor organization could ever declare this water a shared community asset without the landowner's written consent, and that single sentence finished what remained of her argument. Lenora did not laugh again. For the first time since I had met her, she sat still while someone else decided what would happen to the water she had once claimed as her own. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd of residents had already gathered, waiting for Lenora to explain 3 years of drought surcharges that, it turned out, had never been necessary at all. News of the ruling moved through Cedar Hollow faster than either of us reached home, since Tessa had already forwarded the water sale invoices and the surcharge records to the entire board before the hearing even ended. Residents began putting the pieces together on their own, realizing they had spent 3 years paying extra for a shortage that had never actually existed, while the association quietly profited from water it did not own. Lenora tried calling a closed session to regain control of the narrative, but Drew reminded the board in writing that destroying any further records now would violate the judge's preservation order. An emergency general meeting was called for that same evening, and I attended, though I made clear from the outset that I had no interest in personal revenge. I asked only for 4 things: full restoration of everything damaged on my property, reimbursement of every fine and repair cost, an independent financial audit of the association's accounts, and full public disclosure of every contract tied to Alder Spring. Lenora stood in front of the gathered residents and tried to recast herself as the victim of a bitter man determined to punish strong leadership. I said nothing in response and simply played the recording I had captured months earlier, the one where she mocked me for believing history belonged to anyone but the person controlling the files. Tessa followed by presenting the email ordering the destruction of the water sale invoices, and by then no one on the board seemed willing to defend her any longer. A vote of no confidence followed almost immediately, and Lenora was removed from the presidency by an overwhelming margin. She left the meeting alone, with no one bothering to walk out behind her, the silence in the room saying more than any speech could have. The board appointed Tessa as interim president on the spot and approved the independent audit without a single objection. Legally, I now had every right to cut off the water flowing down to the rest of the development immediately, and for a moment the thought crossed my mind. I chose not to because most of my neighbors had done nothing wrong beyond trusting a leader who had betrayed that trust for her own benefit. Instead, I offered a temporary 90-day license allowing the community to keep receiving water while we negotiated a transparent, written agreement going forward. Neighbors who had avoided my eyes at the mailboxes for months began stopping to thank me instead, some of them a little embarrassed, admitting they had believed Lenora's version of events simply because she said it with such confidence. That decision seemed to shift something in how people looked at me around the neighborhood, a quiet recognition of the difference between holding power and using it responsibly. I never had to behave the way Lenora had behaved in order to beat her. The next morning, Lenora herself stood at a distance and watched the maintenance crew unbolt the property of the Homeowners Association sign from the bank of the spring, the same sign that had started everything months earlier. In the weeks that followed, the association reimbursed every fine, every legal cost, and every repair to the mill, while the independent audit uncovered additional irregularities in the accounts from Lenora's years as president details the story never needed to dwell on beyond confirming they existed. The forged 1998 document remained under review by county authorities, a thread the community would continue pulling long after I stopped paying close attention to it. A new agreement was drawn up and signed by both sides, one that finally put everything in writing after more than a century of silence. Under its terms, my family retained full and permanent ownership of Alder Spring. The development could continue drawing surplus water for a modest, clearly stated fee. Any future commercial use required written consent in advance, and all usage data would be made available to residents rather than hidden behind closed doors. I chose to restore the old stone mill rather than let it fall further into ruin, repairing the walls stone by stone with the same care I gave to every historic structure I had ever worked on. I worked on that mill through the following spring, replacing rotted beams with timber cut and joined the same way my grandfather had taught me, careful never to erase the marks the original builders had left behind. Some evenings I would stop halfway through a task just to listen to the spring moving past the open doorway, the same sound that had run under every summer of my childhood, now finally free of locks and warning signs. Inside the restored mill, I framed a copy of the 1894 covenant and hung it beside the photograph of my grandfather standing at the survey marker that had once been stolen and never returned. Tessa asked me once why I still allowed the association to use the water after everything that had happened, and I told her the spring had done nothing wrong simply because Lenora Whitcomb had once stood beside it making threats. On a quiet morning, some weeks later, I walked down to the valve one final time and removed the very last lock from the brass fitting with my own hands. Water moved again into the greenhouse through the old stone trough and continued on toward the community pond exactly as it always had before any of this began. I thought of my grandfather's words as I watched it flow, share the water, but never let anyone erase the name of the person who has the right to share it. From the porch that evening, I looked down at the new sign the association itself had chosen to put up. Small and simple, where the old one had been cold and possessive, reading Alder Spring, a private water source shared with the community by permission of the landowner. Lenora once believed that power meant the ability to lock away another person's water. The covenant from 1894 taught her that real power belongs to whoever still holds the key to open it again.